There is a tablet in Philadelphia. It sits in the Middle East galleries of the Penn Museum, catalogued under the number CBS 10673, and it measures 13 centimetres long, just over 10 wide, and less than 2 centimetres thick. You could hold it in both hands. It weighs very little. It is baked clay, fired at some point in the 17th century BC, and on its surface, pressed by a reed stylus into soft mud 4,000 years ago, someone recorded what may be the oldest version of the most consequential question ever written down in human history. Not the flood. The flood is almost incidental. The question is this: why him? The tablet was excavated at Nippur, the great sacred city of the Sumerian god Enlil, during the University of Pennsylvania's Babylonian expedition in the 1890s. One of the first large-scale American archaeological efforts in Mesopotamia. It passed into the museum's collection and sat, largely unexamined, until 1912, when a scholar named Arno Perbil recognised what he was looking at. He published his translation in 1914 under the title Historical and Grammatical Texts, and when his findings reached the wider academic world, the response was something between astonishment and institutional unease. Because what CBS 10673 contained was a flood narrative, older in certain respects than anything scholars had previously held. The tablet preserves only the lower third of what was originally a much larger document, perhaps 260 lines in total. Much is missing. The top third, which almost certainly contained the opening of the story, the creation of humanity, the establishment of the first cities, the earliest movements of the gods, is gone, lost to whatever it is that destroys clay, moisture, pressure, the patient indifference of 3,000 years. What remains is a fragment. But fragments, in the study of ancient Mesopotamia, are sometimes enough. Somewhere tonight, the world is quiet around you. Whatever room holds you, whatever city, whatever hour, you have chosen to set aside the noise of the present and step carefully into the deep past. If you want to tell us where you are listening from, we would love to know. Drop it in the comments. But for now, settle in, because what the clay remembers is stranger and more deliberate than almost any story the modern world has chosen to tell about it. What remains tells us that the gods gathered, that they made a decision, that one man was warned, and that after the waters came and went, that man was taken somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary existence and given something that no other human being in the text receives. He was given eternal life. The question CBS 0673 quietly poses, the question that scholars have circled for over a century, and that three separate ancient texts approach from three separate angles without ever quite answering, is not whether the flood happened. It is not even whether the gods were real. The question is far more precise than either of those. It is, what were the Anunnaki actually trying to preserve? What did this one man carry that no one else could? And was the choice to save him, made apparently against the will of the divine assembly, truly a spontaneous act of compassion, or something else entirely? Something planned, something that required the waters to come first, so that what survived them would be all that remained. The cities before the waters. To understand why one man was chosen, it is necessary to understand what world he was chosen from, and to do that, we must begin with a document even stranger than the flood tablet itself. In the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, there is a vertical clay prism approximately 9 inches tall, inscribed on all 4 sides with dense cuneiform text. It carries the accession number 1923, 444, and it is known as the Weld-Blundell prism, after Herbert Weld-Blundell, the British collector who acquired it in Iraq and donated it to the museum in 1923. Scholars refer to it more commonly as WB444, and the text it contains is called the Sumerian King List, a document that, in the bluntest possible terms, traces the entirety of human political history from its absolute beginning to the time of its composition, approximately 1800 BCE. What the Sumerian King List records first is not a dynasty you can verify archaeologically. What it records first is a world that existed, according to the Sumerian scribes who wrote it down, before a great catastrophe reorganized everything that came after. The text opens with words that have no parallel in anything else the ancient world produced. It says simply, that kingship descended from heaven. Not that a city elected a ruler, not that a powerful family consolidated authority, but that the institution of governance itself arrived from above, was placed in a specific city, and was subsequently transferred from one location to another as the gods directed. The first city named is Eridu, the oldest known settlement in southern Mesopotamia, established perhaps as early as 5000 BCE on the edge of the marshlands, where the Euphrates once met the Persian Gulf. Before the flood, according to WB 444, kingship passed through 5 cities and rested with 8 kings. Their names are recorded. Their reign lengths are staggering. The first king of Eridu was Enlil, who reigned for 28,800 years. He was followed by Alaugar, who held the kingship for 36,000 years. The dynasties moved to Badtabira, to Larak, to Sippar, and finally to Shuruppak, each city receiving the divine office of kingship in succession, each ruled by figures whose lifespans stretch into numbers that no modern interpreter takes literally. The 8 antediluvian kings together ruled for a combined 241,200 years. And then, in 5 Sumerian words that require no commentary and receive none in the text, the king list records what happened next, Amarubo Rata. Then the flood swept over. The phrase appears once, without elaboration. It functions as a historical marker, not a myth, not a digression, but a date, a boundary. Before it, one kind of world, after it, another. The king list then proceeds to record the first post-Diluvian dynasty in the city of Kish, where kingship descended from heaven again, was reinstated, re-established, as if the institution required renewal after the waters had erased whatever it had been before. The contrast between the antediluvian reign lengths and the post-Diluvian ones is striking and deliberate. Before the flood, individual kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the numbers collapse quickly. The first king of Kish after the deluge, Jushur, reigned for 1200 years. His successors fall further. By the time the list reaches historically verifiable dynasties, rulers whose names appear also on excavated inscriptions and monuments, the reign lengths are down to figures compatible with human lifespans, 30 years, 2515. Thorkild Jacobsen, the Danish-American Assyriologist, who produced the landmark 1939 edition of the Sumerian King List, and spent much of his scholarly career interpreting Sumerian religious texts, read this pattern as a literary device, a graduated diminishment that the scribes used to bridge the mythological past with the historical present. The inflated numbers, in his interpretation, were not claims to literal history, but were rather markers of a different kind of time, sacred time, mythological time, the age before things were as they are now. This interpretation is the scholarly mainstream, and it is worth taking seriously on its own terms. The Sumerians were sophisticated literary craftsmen. They knew what a number meant, and it is entirely possible, probable, many scholars would say, that the antediluvian reign lengths are symbolic rather than chronological, encoding the idea of an earlier age that operated under fundamentally different conditions without making a claim that any specific individual actually lived for 28,800 years. But the Sumerian King List was not a mythological text. It was an administrative and political document used by actual rulers to legitimize actual dynasties. It was referenced in royal inscriptions, copied in scribal schools, circulated across centuries as a functional record of political authority. The men who commissioned it were not composing mythology. They were arguing that their rule was legitimate because kingship traced an unbroken line from divine origin, and that line passed through the flood. What this means for our investigation is important. The flood in the Sumerian king list is not a spiritual event or a metaphorical purging. It is a historical boundary. There was a world before it. That world ended. A different world began afterward. And embedded in the record of that transition, in the gap between the last antediluvian king and the first post-diluvian one, is a silence where the flood survivor should appear and does not. The king list does not name Ziusudra. It names his predecessor, Ubaratutu, as the last king of Shuruppak before the waters came. It records the end of his reign. And then the flood sweeps over and the list moves on. The man who crossed that threshold, the man who was saved, exists in a space the king list acknowledges but does not examine. He is the gap between two worlds. To find him and to understand why he was chosen to stand in that gap, we have to look at the texts that did examine him directly. And those texts, as we will see, are far more interested in the question of the choice than most modern readers have recognized. The world that existed before the flood was not a primitive one, according to the Sumerian records. It was a world of cities, of temples, of administrative structure, of the specific kind of divine human relationship the Sumerians called the me, the sacred offices and civilizational functions that the gods had established, and that human institutions were designed to carry forward. That world was, according to the Sumerian perspective, functioning as it was meant to function. Kingship had come from heaven, cities had been founded under divine patronage, the relationship between gods and humans had been, for all its tensions, organised and operational. What the flood erased in a single phrase, in 5 words, without ceremony, was all of that. What it preserved was one man, one family, and something that the text will eventually describe as the seed of mankind. The question of what that seed actually was, biological, intellectual, spiritual, or administrative, is precisely what the 3 major Sumerian and Akkadian flood texts spend their most careful language trying to answer. The assembly that voted against us. There is a moment in the Atrahasis epic, preserved primarily on tablet BM 78941 in the British Museum, an old Babylonian clay tablet inscribed during the reign of King Ammi-Saduqa of Babylon, approximately 1647 to 1626 BCE, that receives very little attention in popular retellings of the flood story, but which may be the most revealing thing the ancient Mesopotamian tradition recorded about the nature of divine governance. The gods held a vote, and they voted for extinction. To understand what this means within the Sumerian theological framework, it is necessary to understand who the Anunnaki were in the textual tradition, not in later extrapolated interpretations, but as they appear in the clay. The word Anunnaki, written in Sumerian as Dr Anunnakine, translates most accurately as those of princely seed or the great princes of heaven, and in the text it refers to the great divine council, the assembly of major gods who collectively governed cosmic and terrestrial order. They are distinct from the Igigi, the lower rank of divine labourers. The Anunnaki were the decision makers. The 7 greatest among them, An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nanna, Utu and Inanna, held what the texts describe as the me, the divine offices that governed every function of civilization, kingship, priesthood, music, writing, mathematics, descent into the underworld, warfare, craftsmanship. The Atrahasis epic opens not with a flood, but with a labour dispute. Before humans existed, according to BM 78941, the Igigi, the lesser gods, performed all the physical labour of maintaining the world, digging the Tigris and Euphrates, opening irrigation channels, building the infrastructure of civilization. The text describes 40 years of this labour, then mentions that the Igigi could bear it no more. They burned their tools. They marched on the dwelling of Enlil. They surrounded his great temple, the Eka at Nippur, in the middle of the night. Enlil, the text says, could not sleep. He called the assembly. What followed was a negotiation among the great Anunnaki gods that resulted in the creation of humanity. Enki and the birth goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag or Mami in this text, combined clay with the blood of a slaughtered god to make the first human beings, who would take on the burden of labour that had broken the Igigi. This is, in the Atrahasis tradition, the explicit reason for human existence, to relieve the lesser gods from toil. Humanity was made, in other words, not as the pinnacle of creation, but as a solution to a management problem. This context matters enormously for understanding what came next. The humans reproduced, their numbers grew, and as the population increased, so did the noise. The Akkadian word used in BM 78941 is rigmu, a word that encompasses sound, clamour, tumult, and by extension the sheer volume of a large and active civilization. The text records that the noise became so overwhelming that Enlil, the great lord of the divine assembly, could not sleep. Here the Atrahasis text repeats the insomnia motif that opened the epic. Enlil first unable to sleep because of the Igigi's complaints, now unable to sleep because of humanity's noise, and the symmetry is not accidental. The scribes who composed the Atrahasis epic were precise literary craftsmen. The parallel structure signals that what follows will mirror what preceded it: a council, a decision, a solution. The difference is that this time the solution being proposed is not creation but annihilation. Enlil proposed a plague first. The plague god Numtar was dispatched, but Enki, who alone among the Anunnaki maintained a relationship with humanity, particularly with Atrahasis, quietly advised his human protégé to direct all worship toward Numtar alone, to shower the plague god with offerings until he relented. The plague ended, the population recovered, the noise returned. Enlil then proposed famine, the withholding of rain, the failure of harvests, the diminishment of the herds. Again, Enki found a way to counsel Atrahasis to guide the people through the crisis. Famine eased. The noise resumed. The third proposal, the one that the assembled Anunnaki accepted and swore under oath to carry out, was the flood. And this is the procedural detail that the texts record with unusual specificity. The decision was made under oath. All the great gods were present. All of them swore. The Sumerian term for this binding divine compact is mamatu, a word that encompasses both the oath itself and the curse that falls upon whoever breaks it. The mamatu of the divine assembly was, within the theological framework of ancient Mesopotamia, as binding as the laws of cosmic order. To break it was not merely a transgression, it was an act that could destabilize the structure of reality itself. The Gilgamesh flood tablet, K3375, preserved in room 55 of the British Museum, and measuring 15 centimetres long by 13 wide, records this same moment from Utnapishtim's perspective. Speaking to Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim says that the great gods, Anu, Enlil, Ninurta, Enki, and Ea, were sworn to secrecy about their plan to send the flood. The swearing of the oath and the swearing to secrecy are two sides of the same act. The gods had agreed on a catastrophe. They had bound themselves to it, and they had bound themselves to silence about it. No human was supposed to know. The Eridu Genesis tablet, CBS 10673, preserves its account of the divine decision in lacunose but consistent form. Jacobson's 1981 analysis in the Journal of Biblical Literature notes that the surviving text indicates an irrevocable divine decree, a phrase the tablet uses that corresponds to the Mamitu framework in the Akkadian tradition. Anu and Enlil were the primary architects of the decision. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, was present at the assembly. He too heard the decree. He too, in theory, was bound by it. What makes the three traditions consistent, and what makes the Divine Council scene so significant for our investigation, is that every version of the flood narrative emphasizes the same structural reality. The decision was collective, it was binding, and it was designed to be total. No exceptions had been negotiated. No human was to survive. The waters would come, the texts say, and would wipe out mankind. The Akkadian phrase in Atrahasis is Nililik, let the people perish, so completely that the gods would be able to start the relationship with humanity over, if they chose to, on their own terms. This is the world into which the warning arrives. One man in one city, sleeping in his house on the banks of the Euphrates, and a god who had sworn an oath moving through the night toward the wall of a reed hut, carrying something that was either compassion or a plan. The name that means everything. The flood hero appears in 3 distinct ancient traditions under 3 distinct names, and this is not an accident of translation or a matter of regional variation alone. Each name encodes a specific idea about who this person was and why the gods, or one god, chose him. Taken together, the 3 names constitute a kind of theological argument about the nature of the choice, compressed into the most compact literary unit available to an ancient writer, the name itself. In the Eridu Genesis, preserved on CBS 10673, the flood survivor is called Zesudra. The name is Sumerian, and scholarly consensus reads it as Ziad Surah, translated most commonly as life of distant days, or he whose life is long of days. The Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades at the Penn Museum working with the Nippur tablets, and whose 1956 work, History Begins at Sumer, remains a foundational text in the field, rendered the name as life of long days, with the specific connotation of life extended beyond natural duration. The name is prospective. It describes not what Ziusudra was at the time of the flood, but what he would become afterward, a being granted time beyond the ordinary measure of human existence. This is a name given in anticipation of an outcome that had not yet occurred when the flood narrative begins. The Sumerian scribes who composed or preserved the Eridu Genesis tradition gave their flood hero a name that describes his end state, not his beginning. He is called, in other words, by the name he will earn. In the Atrahasis epic, tablet BM 78941, the hero's name is Akkadian, Atrahas, meaning extra wise, or exceedingly wise. Stephanie Daly, in her authoritative 2000 translation and commentary Myths from Mesopotamia, notes that this name functions as both an epithet and an identifier. It is not merely a description of Atrahasis' intelligence in the ordinary sense, but a designation of his relationship to a specific category of knowledge, the thesis, wisdom that encompasses foresight, craft, and the capacity to interpret divine communication. Atrahasis is the man who is wise enough to understand what the gods are actually saying and what they are not. The name matters because in the theological framework of the Atrahasis epic, the selection criterion for survival is never stated explicitly. No god stands before a population and conducts an examination. No divine edict announces that the wisest man will be preserved. What we see, instead, is the outcome. Enki chooses to warn Atrahasis, and Atrahasis, being what his name describes, understands the warning and acts on it. His name implies that the quality which marked him for the god's attention was precisely his capacity to receive and correctly interpret divine communication. He was not chosen because he was righteous in a moral sense, not chosen because he was powerful, not chosen because he was random. He was chosen because he could hear. In the Gilgamesh flood narrative, tablet C on K3375, the hero's name changes again. He is Utnapishtim, or, in the full variant recorded in some manuscripts, Utanaishtim, a name that Daly and others translate as he who found life, or he has found breath, with the root Napishtim from the Akkadian Napatu, breath, life, pointing directly toward what the flood episode ultimately grants him. Like Zisudra, Utnapishtim's name describes his outcome rather than his origin. He is defined by what he survives into, not merely what he survives from. Reading these 3 names in sequence creates a coherent portrait of the same figure viewed from 3 distinct theological angles. In the Sumerian tradition, he is characterized by the duration of life he will receive, the temporal gift of the god's final blessing. In the Akkadian Atrahasis tradition, he is characterized by the cognitive quality that made him suitable for receiving the warning, his capacity for a specific kind of wisdom. In the later Gilgamesh tradition, he is characterized by the thing he ultimately achieves, the finding of life itself, breath prolonged beyond death. None of these names describes a man who survived by chance. None suggests he was simply in the right place, or lucky, or merely well connected. Each name is a statement about a category of person, and taken together, they suggest that the ancient traditions across centuries of transmission and translation maintained a consistent position on why this particular human being was the one who crossed the boundary between the pre-flood and post-flood worlds. He was, in some sense, that the texts clearly regard as meaningful, the right kind of person to carry what needed carrying. What that was remains the question. The wall between gods and men. There is a scene in the Atrahasis epic, preserved in the British Museum's tablet BM 78941, and its companion piece BM 1889426.236, that scholars of Mesopotamian literature have analysed with particular care, not because it is dramatic, but because it is procedurally strange in a way that reveals something important about the nature of the divine choice. Enki does not go to Atrahasis directly. After the divine assembly has sworn its oath, the Manitou that bound all the great gods to the destruction of mankind, Enki faces an impossible position. He is a member of the assembly. He participated in the deliberation. He swore the oath, or was present while it was sworn, and the binding force of divine covenant would fall on him if he violated it. The other gods, in the post-flood scene as recorded in Gilgamesh Tablet C, explicitly accuse him of exactly this. Ninurta says to Enlil, "Who else but Ea could do such a thing? It is Ea who knew all our plans." And Enki, in his defence, does not deny warning someone. He denies only that he did it in the way the oath would prohibit. He says, in effect, "I did not tell a man, I told a wall." The Atrahasis text records what has become known as the reed wall scene. Enki approaches the reed house where Atrahasis is sleeping and speaks not to Atrahasis but to the structure around him. The translation of Tablet 3 in Lambert and Millard's 1969 critical edition renders it this way: "Wall, listen to me. Reed wall, pay attention to all my words. Flee the house, build a boat, forsake possessions, and save life." This is a juridical manoeuvre of extraordinary subtlety. Enki has technically honoured his oath not to reveal the flood plan to any human being. He spoke to an inanimate object, a wall of woven reeds. The wall, having no capacity to hear, passed nothing on to anyone. What happened to the man sleeping inside that house, what he happened to overhear, what his wise and attentive mind happened to receive while resting near a wall that someone was speaking to, that, Enki can argue, is not his responsibility. The academic analysis of this scene by Katarina Kletskowska, published in the journal Ex Nihilo in 2012, traces the reed wall motif across Mesopotamian and Greek tradition, noting that the mechanism of indirect speech, the use of an intermediary object or space to convey information without, technically breaking an oath of secrecy, appears in multiple ancient Near Eastern contexts. In the Mesopotamian tradition specifically, it serves to preserve Enki's relationship with the divine assembly while simultaneously preserving the human world. The loophole is not incidental, it is the mechanism of salvation. This procedural detail, the specific care taken to root the warning through a legal fiction, is one of the aspects of the flood narrative that mainstream interpretations acknowledge without always addressing directly. If the story were a simple tale of divine compassion, Enki's concern with the technicalities of his oath would be unnecessary. A god acting from pure emotion, saving a man he loved, would not need to craft a workaround. The care with which the text records Enki's method suggests that the choice to warn Atrahasis was not an impulsive act of sentiment. It was a considered decision executed with legal precision by a god who was simultaneously bound to a collective decision and committed to its circumvention. The Gilgamesh version on K3375 records the same moment with consistent detail. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh, Ea, the Lord of Wisdom, repeated the plan to my house of reeds. And in the later confrontation between Enlil and Ea after the flood, when Enlil asks how a man survived the destruction, Ea offers a defence that is preserved in the tablet with striking specificity. He did not directly reveal the decision of the gods. He sent a dream or spoke to a wall, and Atrahasis, being who he was, possessing what his name described, understood. The Eridu Genesis tradition on CBS Note 673 is less explicit about the mechanism, owing to the tablet's lacunae in precisely this section. But the description that precedes the flood, what the Penn Museum's own catalogue entry characterises, as Enki reveals the gods' plan to destroy the human race by means of a flood to Ziusudra the king and urges him to heed his advice, suggests that here too the communication was understood to have been indirect. Jacobson's reconstruction of the Eridu Genesis narrative, based on the surviving text, combined with parallels from the Ashurbanipal Library's bilingual fragment, places the warning in a context of divinely granted prophetic hearing rather than direct divine speech. What does the reed wall scene tell us about the nature of the choice? It tells us that Enki's decision to save one man was not a casual act. It was engineered. It required planning, execution, and a careful navigation of divine law. And it required Atrahasis to be exactly the kind of person who could receive an oblique communication through a wall, in a dream, in the ambiguous language of divine implication, and understand it fully enough to act. The question this raises is not whether Enki cared about humanity in an emotional sense. The texts are clear that he did, and that his care stands in contrast to Enlil's frustration. The question is why this particular preparation, this specific legal architecture around a single act of warning, was worth constructing. If the goal was simply to prevent humanity's extinction, other mechanisms were available. Enki had, after all, suggested alternative punishments when Enlil proposed earlier destructions, lions, wolves, mechanisms of population control that would not require the wholesale erasure of everything. The flood came anyway. The oath was sworn, and Enki chose not to overturn the assembly's decision, but to work within it, precisely carefully, in a manner that left the cosmic order intact, while threading one man and his cargo through the event that was designed to end everything. What that cargo contained, and what the texts are specifically careful to record about it, is the question the next chapter pursues: what he carried on the waters. The three major flood texts agree that the survivor brought more than his family aboard the vessel. They agree on this point with an explicitness that is easy to read past quickly, but which, when examined carefully, suggests that the act of loading the boat was not simply a practical matter of gathering food and companions. It was, in some sense, that the texts treat as significant an act of selection. The question of what was selected and who decided what to include runs through all three traditions in ways that reveal something of what the Anunnaki, or at least Enki, understood the flood to be destroying. In the Atrahasis epic, Tablet BM 78941, Enki's instructions to Atrahasis include a phrase that Lambert and Millard's critical edition renders: load the boat with the seed of all living things. The Akkadian word here is zur, seed, offspring, lineage, the biological and intellectual continuity of a category. Enki is not telling Atrahasis to bring animals because animals are useful. He is telling him to bring the seed of all living things, which is a different and more comprehensive concept. Seed implies that what is being preserved is not simply the current generation, but the capacity for continuation, the genetic and generational thread of every category of being that existed. The boarding scene in Atrahasis, as preserved in the existing tablets, records that Atrahasis loaded pure animals, fat animals, creatures of the steppe. It records that he loaded his family, and it records, in a passage that the Gilgamesh tradition preserves more completely, something else: craftsmen. Gilgamesh Tablet C, on K3375, gives us Utnapishtim's account in more specific detail. He says, "My relatives and craftsmen and all the beasts and animals of the field boarded the boat." The word translated as craftsmen refers to practitioners of skilled trades, those who worked with wood, with metal, with clay, with textile, with whatever the material technologies of Sumerian civilization required. These were not farmers. They were not administrators. They were the holders of technical knowledge, people who knew how to build, shape, and transform material into the objects and infrastructure that a civilization requires to function. Loading craftsmen onto a vessel before a catastrophe is not a survival instinct. It is a preservation strategy. There is a detail in the later Greek version of the flood narrative written by Berossus, a Babylonian priest of the god Bel who composed a history of Babylon in Greek around 280 BC, that extends this logic in a direction no other ancient source quite matches. Berossus records that the flood hero, whom he calls Sisuthros, a Greek rendering of Ziusudra, was commanded before the flood to bury all available written records in the city of Sippar, the city of the sun god Utu, so that they might survive the waters and be recovered by later generations. After the flood, the voice of a god directs Sisuthros' companions to go to Sippar and dig up the writings which were buried there and which were ordained to be communicated to mankind. Sippar, it is worth noting, appears in the Sumerian king list's antediluvian section as one of the 5 pre-flood cities, the 4th, specifically, before the kingship moved to Shuruppak. It was a city of long institutional memory, of scribal culture, of the kind of archival work that a civilization performs when it understands its own knowledge to be precious and perishable. That Berossus identifies it specifically as the burial site of written knowledge, that the flood hero was instructed not merely to survive, but to ensure the physical survival of recorded information, suggests a tradition that understood the flood as an event with epistemological consequences. Not just lives were at risk, knowledge was at risk. The contrast between what Enlil wanted the flood to achieve and what actually survived it is striking in this light. Enlil wanted silence. He wanted Rigmu extinguished, the intolerable noise of human existence reduced to nothing. What the survivor carried through the flood was everything that noise had produced: the seed of animals, the knowledge of craftsmen, the techniques of building and metalwork and weaving, and, if Berossus is preserving a genuine strand of the ancient tradition, the written records of a civilization that understood its own existence as something worth archiving. This cargo is not what a terrified man fleeing disaster would spontaneously gather. It is what a man who had been carefully instructed would carry. The specificity of what was saved points toward the specificity of what the warning was designed to accomplish. In the Eridu Genesis, CBS 1673, the phrase that survives the tablet's lacunae most clearly is the description of Ziusudra after the flood. He is called Numun Namluulu, the seed of mankind. Not a man, not a survivor, the seed. The language of biological and cultural continuity is not metaphorical here in the way that a modern reader might assume. In Sumerian, Numun refers to that from which a new generation grows, the essential matter that must pass through a bottleneck to ensure that what existed before can exist again. Ziusudra was not saved despite the flood. He was passed through it, the city that kept the secret. The last antediluvian king, according to W444, was Ubaratutu, ruler of Shuruppak, who held the kingship for 18,600 years. After him, the flood swept over, and Shuruppak, the city where the flood hero lived, the city from which he launched his vessel, the last city of the world before the waters came, is one of the few elements of the Sumerian flood narrative that can be examined not only in texts, but in clay and earth. Tel Farah is a low mound rising from the flat plain of southern Iraq, approximately 60 kilometres south of Nippur, near a dry watercourse that was once a branch of the Euphrates. Excavations conducted in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with systematic work, carried out by a German-American team in the 1930s, including Eric Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania, revealed beneath the surface layers of Shuruppak something that the texts had been recording for 3,000 years. A flood layer. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis have placed this sediment deposit at approximately 2900 BC at the boundary between what archaeologists call the Jemdet Nazar period and the early dynastic Phi period. It is a layer of water-laid silt that interrupts the continuous record of human settlement. Below it, one kind of pottery, above it a different kind, and between them a stratum that speaks of a sudden, catastrophic inundation. Samuel Noah Kramer, reflecting on this evidence in the Penn Museum's journal expedition, noted that the flood materials from Shuruppak, and Kish, 3 of the 5 antediluvian cities named in the King list, were excavated over the span of 50 years and by multiple independent teams, and that they converge on the same approximate date. The convergence is imperfect. The flood layer, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, was initially dated by Woolley himself to a much earlier period, a claim that generated significant controversy before subsequent analysis revised the date upward to align more closely with the other sites. The scholarly consensus, as represented in the work of W.G. Lambert, Thorkild Jacobson, and the Penn Museum's own analysis, is that these flood deposits reflect one or more major inundations of the southern Mesopotamian plain around 2900 BCE, events dramatic enough to interrupt settlement, enter cultural memory, and eventually crystallize into the literary tradition we have been examining. The floods were real, they were catastrophic at a regional scale, and they struck the very cities the Sumerian king list names as the last cities before the flood swept everything away. What this physical evidence does not tell us, and cannot tell us, is whether the flood hero was also real. Archaeology recovers events, not decisions. It can show us that water came, and when and how deeply. It cannot show us what a god said to a wall, or why one man was told to build a boat, or what he carried on it when the rain began. But the convergence between the texts and the physical evidence creates an unusual situation. The Sumerian scribes who recorded the flood narrative were not working entirely from imagination. They were, in some sense, recording an event that had geological consequence. The city they named as the flood hero's home was a real city that experienced a real catastrophic inundation at roughly the time their documents imply. Shuruppak was, additionally, a city of documented scribal activity. Among the oldest cuneiform tablets ever found are the Shuruppak tablets, administrative and literary documents excavated from Tel Farah and dated to approximately 2600 BC, a few centuries after the flood layer. They include the instructions of Shuruppak, a wisdom text attributed to the city itself, presented as the advice of a father named Shuruppak to his son Ziusudra. The instructions of Shuruppak are among the oldest examples of systematic ethical instruction in human history, and they are addressed in the text to the flood hero himself, cast as the young recipient of his father's accumulated wisdom before the catastrophe. This is a document of knowledge transmission, a father speaking to a son. A city, apparently, understood to be the source of the kind of wisdom that the flood hero needed to carry. The proximity of these traditions is striking, the physical evidence of a real flood. The name of the flood hero embedded in one of the oldest surviving wisdom texts, positioned as its intended recipient, the city destroyed by water, and also identified as the origin of the knowledge the survivor was meant to preserve. Whether these threads connect into a single historical reality or represent the convergence of multiple independent traditions onto a common cultural memory is precisely the kind of question the tablets invite us to ask, and then, with characteristic restraint, decline to answer. Enlil's fury and the question of intent. The moment after the flood is, in many ways, more revealing than the flood itself. In all three major traditions, the catastrophe ends, the waters recede, the vessel grounds on solid earth, and the survivor emerges. He sacrifices, he makes offerings. The gods smell the smoke of the sacrifice and gather around it. And in the Atrahasis tradition, on BM 78941, the text records one of the most striking details in all of Mesopotamian literature. The gods, who have just ended civilization in order to silence the noise of humanity, are hungry. Without farmers, without priests, without the human infrastructure that generated the offerings and libations that sustained them, the gods are experiencing what the text calls thirst and hunger. The Atrahasis tablets record that the Anunnaki, the great gods, were sitting in thirst and hunger. This was edited out of the Gilgamesh version. Geoffrey Teague, professor of Hebrew and Semitic languages at the University of Pennsylvania, documented this editorial removal in his 1982 study, The Evolution of the Gilgamesh Epic, noting that the later compiler of Gilgamesh Tablet C replaced "they were sitting in thirst and hunger with the gods, feared the deluge," apparently preferring a version that did not portray the divine council as experiencing creaturely need. The original detail, however, is significant. The gods who voted to destroy humanity found themselves, immediately after the destruction, dependent on what they had destroyed. The logic of the Atrahasis epic at this point is quietly devastating. The gods made humans to relieve them from labour, and then, when the humans became inconveniently noisy, decided to eliminate them, without considering that the elimination of their labour force would eliminate their food supply. It was, as Enki later says in his post-flood rebuke to Enlil, an act without consideration. When Enlil arrives at the sacrifice and sees the boat, his reaction in the Gilgamesh Tablet C is immediate and furious. Where did a living being escape? No man was to survive the annihilation. The Sumerian phrase for this in the Atrahasis tradition, Mamala Imein Admikti, conveys not just surprise, but the specific indignation of a violated legal order. The oath had been sworn, the outcome had been determined, and yet somehow a man was alive. Ninurta tells Enlil the obvious. Ea, only Ea could have done this. And then Ea speaks, and what he says has been analysed by scholars, including Tikva Frye-Makensky, whose 1977 paper in the Biblical Archaeologist examined the Atrahasis epic's theological framework in detail. Enki E does not apologise. He does not confess to having warned Atrahasis directly. He offers instead a defence that operates on two levels simultaneously. On the first level, it is a legal argument. E claims he did not reveal the secret of the gods. He sent a dream. He spoke to a wall of reeds. Atrahasis, being who he was, understood. The Mamatu, the divine oath, was, by this argument, technically intact. On the second level, it is a moral argument. Ea accuses Enlil of disproportionality. Instead of bringing about a flood, he says in the Atrahasis tradition, lions and wolves should have appeared and diminished the people. Instead of bringing about a flood, famine should have occurred and the land laid low. The flood was excessive. It risked destroying not just the noise, but everything, including the relationship between gods and humans that made the gods' own existence sustainable. Enlil, in the surviving text, does not refute this argument. He accepts it. And in the Gilgamesh version on K3375, the text records that Enlil then boards the boat, takes Utnapishtim by the hand, and elevates him. Formerly Utnapishtim was a human being, but now he and his wife have become gods like us. Let Utnapishtim reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. This is the moment the scholarly tradition has most consistently interpreted as a narrative resolution. Enlil, chastened by Enki's arguments, accepts the flood hero's survival and grants him immortality as a sign of divine reconciliation. And this interpretation is coherent and well supported. But there is a detail that this reading tends to absorb, without fully examining, Enlil does not simply pardon Utnapishtim, he deifies him. He places him not in a city, not among ordinary humans, but in a location that is outside the world as humans experience it, at the mouth of the rivers, in Utnapishtim's case, or in Dilmun, in Ziusudra's. The survivor is removed from human society as completely as if he had died. He becomes inaccessible. The question this raises is not small. If Enlil accepted the survival of the flood hero as a reasonable outcome, if he could look at Utnapishtim standing before him and decide that this life was worth keeping, why could that same reasoning not be extended to others? Why, when Gilgamesh later travels across the entire known world to find Utnapishtim and beg for the secret of immortality, is the answer no? Utnapishtim himself tells Gilgamesh the circumstances that led to his immortality were unique, never to be repeated. This stipulation, built into the narrative with apparent deliberateness, suggests that what was given to the flood hero was not a precedent. It was a one-time resolution constructed for a specific purpose, around a specific person, at a specific moment in the history of the relationship between gods and humans. The flood survivor was not preserved so that others could follow his path. He was preserved so that what he carried could re-enter the world. Once it had re-entered, his work was done. He was placed somewhere outside time, outside history, outside the reach of those who came after, and what he had brought through the waters was left to grow, to spread, to become the civilization that inherited the silence after the flood. The shore of Dilmun. The Eridu Genesis tablet CBS Tono 673 ends its account of Ziusudra's survival with a passage that Thorkild Jacobsen reconstructed and analysed in his 1981 Journal of Biblical Literature paper as one of the most theologically concentrated sections of the entire text. The surviving lines, numbers 258 through 261, after the final lacuna that obscures the actual granting of eternal life, describe the aftermath this way. King Ziusudra, who protected the seed of mankind at the time of destruction, they settled him in an overseas country, in the land of crossing, in the land of Dilmun, the place where the sun rises. This is the only element of the Eridu Genesis flood tradition that has no parallel in the Atrahasis epic. Atrahasis is given eternal life, according to the Gilgamesh version, which preserves Enki's post-flood instructions, and is taken away to dwell at the mouth of the rivers, a place that, like Dilmun, sits at the edge of the known world. But Dilmun itself, named specifically in the Sumerian tradition, is not merely a direction. It is a place with its own extensive mythological and geographical identity within the Sumerian tradition. Dilmun appears in dozens of Sumerian texts, outside the flood narrative. It is described as the land where the sun rises, where the raven does not croak, where the lion does not kill, where there is no sickness and no death. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, Oxford, preserves hymns to Dilmun that characterize it as the original pure land, the place of divine origin, the location before the world acquired its current condition of toil and mortality. In one of the most famous Sumerian mythological texts, Enki and Ninurta, preserved in multiple copies from the Nippur archives, Dilmun is described as the place where Enki himself dwelt before the organisation of the present world. The question of where Dilmun actually was is one that has occupied archaeologists and historians for over a century. The modern scholarly consensus, represented in the work of archaeologist Jifri Bibi and supported by excavations conducted on the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf beginning in the 1950s, identifies ancient Dilmun with the Bahrain region, an archipelago at the head of the Gulf where archaeological evidence confirms long-distance trade with Mesopotamia as early as the 3rd millennium BC. The Bahrain sites contain burial mounds and temple complexes that align with what Sumerian texts describe as characteristic of Dilmun's sacred geography. Not all scholars accept this identification fully. Some propose that Dilmun referred to different geographic locations at different periods of Sumerian history, or that the name designated a mythological space that was later mapped onto a real geographic place. Jacobson himself was cautious about the equation, preferring to treat Dilmun primarily as a cosmological location, the eastern horizon, the place where the sun rose each day from beneath the waters, rather than as a specific island identifiable on a modern map. What all interpretations agree on, however, is what Dilmun meant in the Sumerian theological imagination. It was a place outside the ordinary world, a threshold between the human and divine, a location where the normal rules of mortality and toil did not apply. To send Ziusudra there was not to reward him with a pleasant retirement. It was to remove him from the category of human beings entirely and to place him in the category of things that endure, things that are, like the sun rising daily from beneath the eastern waters, both present and unreachable. The Gilgamesh narrative builds its entire dramatic architecture on the inaccessibility of Utnapishtim. Gilgamesh crosses the waters of death to find him. He makes a journey that the text describes as unprecedented. No one has crossed those waters while still alive. No one has made the journey Gilgamesh makes. And when he finally reaches Utnapishtim and hears the flood story, what he learns is not the secret of immortality. He learns that the circumstances of Utnapishtim's survival, the specific convergence of divine decision and divine circumvention, cannot be reproduced. The flood was a singular event. The oath was sworn once. The warning came through a wall of reeds one time to one man who was wise enough to hear it. There is a reading of this structure, the flood survivor placed permanently beyond reach, the knowledge of his circumstances accessible only through a story that ends without offering a path to replication, that asks whether the inaccessibility is itself the point. If what the flood survivor carried was knowledge, civilization, the seed of mankind, then it has already been delivered. It is already in the world. The man who carried it has been placed where he can never be interfered with and never return, in a land where the sun rises and nothing ends. The civilization that was planted from his cargo is the world we inherited. Whether that reading is symbolic, metaphorical, or something else, whether the shore of Dilmun is a metaphor for the horizon of historical memory, or a place, or a theological concept, or all three at once, is precisely what the tablets decline to specify. 3 survivors, 1 pattern. The 3 flood narratives we have been examining were not composed simultaneously. They represent what scholars of ancient Mesopotamia call a manuscript tradition, a sequence of compositions, revisions, and transmissions that span more than 1,000 years of scribal culture, from the earliest recoverable form of the Atrahasis epic in the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BCE, through the Eridu Genesis tablets dated to approximately 1650 BIS, to the standard Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic, compiled by the scholar-scribe Sinliku Ninni, somewhere between 1300 and 1000 BIS, and finally to the Neo-Assyrian Library of Ashurbanipal copies at Nineveh in the 7th century BIS, from which K3375 was recovered. This is over 1,000 years of transmission. Across that span, 3 named scholars and numerous unnamed scribes worked with, copied, revised, expanded, and in some cases deliberately edited the flood narrative. And yet the core structure of the story, the divine decision, the oath, the warning through a wall, the specific cargo, the landing, the sacrifice, the confrontation between Enlil and Enki, and the elevation of the flood hero to a state beyond ordinary humanity remained consistent. Geoffrey Tugai's meticulous comparative analysis of the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh versions documents the precise textual inheritance. Entire lines were copied from the Atrahasis tablets into Gilgamesh Tablet C, sometimes verbatim, sometimes with small but revealing editorial changes. The table of parallel passages Tugai compiled shows that phrases like wall, listen to me, Atrahasis III, I 20 become wall, pay attention in Gilgamesh She, line 22, like the Apsu you shall roof it, is identical in both versions. One person could not see, another appears in both as thee. description of the flood's chaos. The editorial changes that were made are, in some ways, more informative than the passages preserved unchanged. As noted earlier, the Gilgamesh compiler removed the detail about the gods being hungry during the flood, apparently finding it theologically uncomfortable that the divine council had been reduced to dependence on the very species it had tried to eliminate. The Gilgamesh version also expands the flood heroes' pre-flood preparations significantly, adding engineering details about the vessel's construction, its 6 decks, its equal measurements, the precise quantities of bitumen used to seal it, that are absent or less detailed in Atrahasis. The expansion of technical detail in the later version is itself a pattern worth noting. The Gilgamesh compiler, working in or after the Kassite period, when Babylonian scribal culture was reaching its classical peak, added specificity to the ark's construction while removing theological ambiguity about the god's condition. What was made more precise was the physical object. What was made less explicit was the divine need. The fragment published by Jeremiah Peterson in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies in 2018, a newly recovered portion of the Eridu Genesis tradition from the ancient city of adds a further dimension to the manuscript tradition. Peterson's analysis of this fragment, which he dates to the Old Babylonian period, shows that the version of the flood story contained details about the divine appointment of the first antediluvian king that do not appear in the Nippur version preserved on CBS 10673. This suggests that the Eridu Genesis tradition existed in multiple regional variants, each preserving different emphases of the same underlying narrative, much as the Atrahasis tradition itself is known from both Babylonian and Assyrian dialect versions. What we have, in other words, is not a single author's invention. What we have is a tradition maintained across a millennium, carried through multiple scribal schools, copied in multiple cities, translated between Sumerian and Akkadian, and preserved with sufficient care that modern scholars can reconstruct its trajectory across time. The traditions of the ancient Near East did not accidentally preserve stories. Scribal schools were expensive institutions. The tablets they produced were curated, catalogued, and stored with deliberate attention. The library of Ashurbanipal, where K3375 was found, was assembled by a Neo-Assyrian king who explicitly sent agents throughout the empire to collect texts, to gather what existed in other cities and bring it to Nineveh for preservation. The flood narrative was important enough to be sought out, copied, and stored at the highest level of royal investment. What does it mean that the same story, the divine decision, the oath, the one man warned, the seed carried through the waters, was considered worth preserving for over 1,000 years? Lambert and Millard, in their landmark 1969 edition of the Atrahasis text, argue that the flood narrative was understood as foundational mythology, the explanation for why humanity exists, why humans die, and why the relationship between gods and humans takes the form it does. The flood is the event that reorganises everything, and the flood hero is the pivot on which that reorganisation turns. This is the mainstream scholarly reading, and it is substantive. But the persistence of the pattern, the specific details maintained across centuries of copying and revision, the refusal to simplify or mythologise the Divine Council's legal procedures, the care with which the oath and its circumvention are described, raises a question that Thorkild Jacobson articulated in his 1981 paper, and that YS Chen revisited in his 2013 monograph, The Primeval Flood Catastrophe. What does it mean that a scribal culture that was sophisticated enough to edit, expand, and revise these texts chose consistently to preserve the legal architecture of the divine choice rather than streamline it into simple narrative? Simple narratives are easier to copy, they are more memorable, they travel better across time and translation, and yet the Sumerian and Akkadian scribes, generation after generation, kept the Mamatu, kept the reed wool, kept the post-flood confrontation between Enlil and Enki. They kept the procedural strangeness of the choice, even when they had the skill and the authority to smooth it away, what the mainstream leaves unanswered. To engage honestly with the questions this investigation has raised, it is necessary to examine what the scholarly mainstream says about the flood narrative with genuine care, not as a position to be refuted, but as the most rigorous available framework for understanding what the texts contain. The consensus position, represented most authoritatively in the work of Thorkild Jacobson, W. G. Lambert, and A. R. Millard, Andrew George, and Y. S. Chen, holds that the Sumerian and Akkadian flood narratives are mythological compositions, complex literary texts that use the structure of narrative to explore theological and philosophical questions about human existence, divine governance, and the relationship between creation and destruction. They are not records of historical events in this view, but are rather what Cloud v. Strauss would call mythical thinking, the use of symbolic narrative to process and communicate fundamental truths about the human condition. Within this framework, Ziusudra Atrahasis Utnapishtim is a type, a representative of the wisdom tradition, the ideal human who maintains proper relationship with the divine, even when the divine assembly turns against humanity as a whole. His selection by Enki is not a literal historical event, but a narrative mechanism for explaining two things simultaneously: why humanity survived a catastrophic flood in cultural memory, and what the appropriate human response to divine communication looks like. He survives because he listens, because he trusts, because he acts on wisdom rather than on the chaos of the flood itself. Andrew George's 1999 translation and commentary on the Epic of Gilgamesh, widely considered the definitive modern English edition, places Utnapishtim's story within the epic's broader meditation on mortality and civilization. The flood episode is not primarily about the flood. In George's reading, it is about Gilgamesh's encounter with the limits of what any human being can know, achieve, or outlast. Utnapishtim tells his story not as a lesson in survival, but as a demonstration of the unrepeatable. The conditions that produced immortality are gone. The gods made an exception once. They will not make it again. The moral for Gilgamesh, and through him for the human audience of the epic, is that civilization itself, the walls of Uruk, the lasting works of human hands, is the only immortality available. Tikva Frye-Makensky's 1977 analysis in The Biblical Archaeologist examines the Atrahasis epic specifically through the lens of population theology, the idea that the epic's primary concern is the appropriate size and structure of the human community, and that the flood represents an extreme solution to a problem that Enki argues should have been managed through more proportionate means. In this reading, the choice of Atrahasis is primarily a narrative device for introducing Enki's counter-argument, not that humanity should be saved, but that the method of the flood was the wrong way to address the problem. These interpretations are sophisticated, well-evidenced, and academically mainstream for good reason. They are supported by close reading of the texts, by comparative analysis of the literary traditions, and by the broader context of Mesopotamian religion and theology. What they account for somewhat less easily are a set of specific details that the texts preserve with unusual consistency. The first is the legal precision of the divine oath. If the flood narrative were primarily a theological or philosophical composition, a meditation on human mortality or divine governance, the technical mechanics of the Mammotu and its circumvention would be unnecessary for the story's symbolic purpose. You can tell a story about divine compassion without constructing a legal loophole. The read wall scene is not symbolically essential to the narrative. It is procedurally specific. The texts record exactly why Enki chose the method he chose, and it is a legal reason, not a theological one. The second is the specific content of the ark's cargo. The inclusion of craftsmen, people holding technical knowledge, not simply biological seed stock, is not required by a mythological narrative about survival. The story works perfectly well with animals and family. The craftsmen are an addition that shifts the cargo from survival provision to civilizational transmission. This detail is in the texts, repeated across traditions, and it points toward a preservation strategy rather than a survival instinct. The third is the specific location of Dilmun and the specific phrase seed of mankind. The Eridu does not say Ziusudra was given rest, or peace, or divine favour in an undifferentiated sense. It says specifically that he was placed in Dilmun because he protected the seed of mankind at the time of destruction. The language frames his survival not as a personal reward, but as the completion of a mission. He was given eternal life because he had successfully carried something that needed carrying. The fourth is the post-flood adjustment to human reproduction and lifespan. In the Atrahasis tradition, the gods' post-flood discussion does not simply accept that humanity will continue as before. It introduces mechanisms of population control, celibacy, infant mortality, the reduction of human lifespan that would prevent the situation that prompted the flood from recurring. The pre-flood world, with its vast and noisy population and its king lists of beings who lived for tens of thousands of years, is specifically not restored. Something different is established instead. These four details together suggest a coherent structure that the mythological interpretation does not fully address. The flood was not simply an attempt to destroy humanity, and its circumvention was not simply an act of compassion. What the texts describe, if readers records of an event from within their own theological framework, is a managed transition, a catastrophic reduction of an existing state of affairs, carefully preserved at its essential minimum by a god who worked within the legal constraints of the divine. Decision, followed by the deliberate restructuring of the post-flood world to prevent the same situation from arising again. Whether this reading reflects historical memory, symbolic theology, or something that refuses to fit cleanly into either category is precisely what the tablets invite us to hold without resolution: the oath, the ark, and the architecture of preservation. To bring together what the tablets have offered, it is useful to lay the three major interpretive frameworks side by side, not to choose between them, but to examine what each preserves and what each requires us to set aside. The first framework is the mythological reading, which understands the flood narrative as symbolic literature, an ancient culture's way of processing catastrophe, exploring the relationship between divine power and human vulnerability, and encoding the moral message that wisdom and relationship with the divine are the only lasting forms of human security. Within this framework, Ziusudra Atrahasis Utnapishtim is a literary type, every man at his best, the ideal human whose survival represents the survival of the best in human nature. The Anunnaki's choice is not a selection from a population, but a narrative mechanism for demonstrating what kind of person the gods can work with. The flood is not historical but cosmological, a symbolic erasing of an old order and the planting of a new one. This reading is coherent, scholarly, and accounts for the text's literary sophistication. Its limitation is that it does not fully account for the legal specificity of the oath and its circumvention, nor for the precise content of what the survivor carried, nor for the fact that the king list treats the flood as a historical boundary between two verifiable periods of governance rather than as a symbolic event. The second framework is the encoded wisdom reading, which treats the flood narrative as a sophisticated cultural technology, a story designed to transmit, in memorable and replicable form, a set of practical and philosophical instructions about how to survive civilizational collapse. In this reading, the story of one man building a boat and loading it with animals, craftsmen, and the seed of living things is a compressed survival manual, encoding the knowledge that any post-catastrophe rebuilding project requires: biological diversity, technical skills, and the willingness to act on early warning before the catastrophe arrives. The Anunnaki are not literal divine beings, but a metaphor for the forces, environmental, astronomical, geological, that periodically destroy what human civilization has built. And Enki is the wisdom tradition itself, always finding a way to communicate through the walls of complacency. This reading accounts for the practical content of the ark's cargo and for the repetition of the story across cultures and centuries as a kind of civilizational wisdom literature. It is less equipped to explain the legal theology, the Mamitu, the reed wall loophole, the post-flood confrontation, which adds procedural complexity that a survival manual does not require. The third framework takes the texts at their own word, that there were beings, the Anunnaki, the great council of divine figures who governed the early world, who made a specific decision, enforced it through a binding oath, and then found themselves unable to prevent one of their own number from threading a single human being through the catastrophe with precise intention. This reading does not require the Anunnaki to be alien beings or supernatural creatures in any specific modern sense. It requires only that the Sumerian scribes who wrote these texts, and the even older oral traditions they were recording, were describing something they understood to have happened, something that, from within their theological framework, explained why the world was the way it was. Within this third framework, the choice behind the one man saved from the flood was not arbitrary, not symbolic, and not simply compassionate. It was architectural. Enki designed the survival the way he designed everything else he touched in the Sumerian tradition, with legal precision, with technical attention, and with a long view of what the preservation of certain things through the catastrophe would make possible afterward. The craftsmen loaded onto the ark were not passengers, they were a curriculum. The seed of all living things was not simply biological survival insurance. It was the continuity of every category that the pre-flood world had developed, maintained in minimum viable form through an event designed to eliminate it. And Ziusudra himself, the seed of mankind, the man whose name means the long life of distant days, was not simply a survivor. He was a carrier, a vessel for what the flood could not be allowed to take. Whether the Sumerian scribes who copied and preserved these tablets for 1,000 years understood them as history, theology, or wisdom literature, whether they could have drawn the lines between those categories in the first place, is a question their own silence refuses to answer. What they understood clearly enough to preserve with legal precision was this: the Anunnaki made a decision, and within that decision another decision was made, one that required a wall of reeds, and a wise man sleeping near it, and a god who knew the difference between what was bound and what was merely forbidden. Andrew George, in his introductory essay to the Gilgamesh edition, observes that the ancient Mesopotamians understood the preservation of knowledge as a sacred act, that the scribes who copied these tablets were not merely recording stories, but were performing an act of cultural maintenance, ensuring that what the past knew would be accessible to the future. The flood narrative was copied not despite its legal and theological complexity, but because of it. The complexity was the content. The procedural specificity of how one man was saved was, to the scribes who preserved it, the most important part of the story. If the texts are records, if we extend the third interpretive framework and follow its implications without forcing them toward a conclusion, certain questions about the nature of Sumerian civilization become differently configured. The Sumerian scribal tradition did not emerge from nothing. The development of cuneiform writing, the gradual transformation of pictographic administrative tokens into the wedge-pressed syllabic and logographic system that eventually recorded the flood narrative, took place over the course of the 4th and early 3rd millennia BC. By the time the Atrahasis epic was first composed in its surviving form around 1700 BC, Sumerian civilization had already been producing complex written texts for well over 1,000 years. The administrative records of the Ur-3 period, 2112, 2004b, the royal inscriptions of Sargon of Akkad, 2334, 2279b, the legal code traditions that would eventually produce Hammurabi's famous stele, all of these preceded the tablets we have been examining, and all of them reflected an institutional culture in which the preservation and transmission of knowledge was understood as one of the primary functions of the educated class. Samuel Noah Kramer, in History Begins at Sumer, his landmark 1956 survey of Sumerian civilization's firsts, from the first schools to the first legal precedents to the first cosmogony, notes that the Nippur scribal school, known as the Aduba, literally tablet, was producing graduates who could read, write, translate, calculate, and argue legal cases in a language that was already ancient by their own time. By the Old Babylonian period, Sumerian was a dead language, no longer spoken in daily life, but maintained as the language of sacred and legal text by scribes, who studied it the way medieval European scholars studied Latin. They were learning a dead language in order to read and copy texts they considered too important to leave to the vernacular. The flood narrative was among the texts they preserved in this way. What does it mean that a civilization in which writing itself was relatively new chose, among the very first things to commit permanently to clay, the record of an event that happened before writing existed, and chose to commit it with legal precision, with architectural detail, with the specific names of gods and their specific arguments? The mainstream answer is that origin myths are among the first things any literary tradition encodes, because they establish the framework within which everything else is understood. The flood narrative was foundational to the Sumerian worldview, and foundational texts receive the most careful preservation. But a second answer is available, and it is the one the third interpretive framework suggests. The legal and technical detail of the flood narrative was preserved because the scribes understood it to be a record of something that actually required that kind of specificity. Divine oaths require precise wording. Cargo manifests require enumeration. The legal defence of a god before an assembly requires the exact mechanism of the loophole, not a paraphrase of the outcome. If the Sumerian scribes were preserving records, documents that described, from within their own theological perspective, events that they understood to have shaped the world they lived in, then the flood narrative is not a story about survival. It is an account of a transition, a managed catastrophe in which what needed preserving was preserved with deliberate specificity, and what was saved was arranged not for comfort, but for function. The post-flood world the texts describe is, notably, not a restoration of what existed before. The antediluvian cities, with their divine-granted kingships and their extraordinary reign lengths, are not re-established. What is re-established, as the Sumerian king list records, is kingship as an institution, descended from heaven again, placed in new cities, maintained by rulers with measurably shorter lives and measurably more human capacities. The craftsmen who loaded the ark built the first post-flood structures. The seed of all living things repopulated the plains of Mesopotamia. The seed of mankind's Yasudra was placed where he could neither interfere with the new world nor be interfered with in Dilmun, at the place where the sun rises, where the conditions of the old world could neither survive nor return. The civilization that grew from this, the cities of Kish and Uruk and Lagash, the temples and the ziggurats and the tablet houses and the legal codes and the flood narrative itself, was either the recovery of something that had been nearly lost, or the natural development of a human culture that had survived a catastrophic regional flood and rebuilt itself. Or, as the third framework invites us to consider, both things were true simultaneously: a real catastrophe, a deliberate preservation, and a world that understood itself as the inheritor of something that a god had threaded through the eye of the flood with legal precision and architectural intention. The scribes who copied these tablets for 1,000 years did not choose between these readings. They preserved the text as it was given to them, with all its specificity intact. The one who remained. The tablet is still in Philadelphia. CBS 10673 sits in the Middle East galleries of the Penn Museum, 13 centimetres of baked clay from the city of Nippur, pressed by a hand that moved across it in the 17th century BC. It has been held in its current city for well over a century now, since the Babylonian expedition brought it back from the mounds of ancient Mesopotamia and placed it in the collection. It has been studied, photographed, translated, argued over, and referenced in thousands of papers and books and lectures. And it remains, despite all of this, a fragment, the lower third of something larger, missing the beginning and much of the middle, preserving enough to know the shape of what was there, but not enough to resolve its silences. The man at the centre of it sits in his own kind of Dilmun, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, 3 names, one figure existing at the crossing place between 2 worlds that the tablets say no one else has ever stood in. He heard something through a wall. He built something because of what he heard. He carried something across the waters that were designed to erase it. And then, when the waters receded and the sacrifice was made, and the furious god had been persuaded to accept what he had not intended, this one man was taken away to the place where time does not pass, elevated beyond the reach of the world he had helped to seed. What you have heard tonight is the evidence. 3 tablets, 3 names, 1 pattern, a divine assembly that voted unanimously for destruction, a single member of that assembly who found a way, legal, careful, technically precise, to preserve what he believed was worth preserving. A man chosen for the quality of his hearing, for his capacity to receive what was communicated through walls and dreams and the oblique language of divine implication, and a civilization that grew afterward and that chose, generation after generation, in scribal school after scribal school, in city after city, to keep this record and to keep it whole. The question of why he was chosen is the question that opened this investigation and has not, in the end, been answered. Not definitively, not in the way that would allow you to close the tablets and set the question aside. What the texts give us, instead, is the shape of the answer. He was chosen because he was wise enough to hear through walls. He was chosen because he was positioned in the city of Shuruppak in the relationship with Enki that his wisdom had built over a lifetime. He was chosen because what he carried, seed, skill, the capacity to rebuild, was exactly what the post-flood world required, and could not have been carried by anyone who did not know how to receive an indirect warning and act on it before the rain began. He was chosen, in the end, because the God who chose him had been thinking about this for longer than any single catastrophe. Whether the Anunnaki were divine beings, cosmic principles, the memory of an extraordinary civilization, or something that defies the categories available to us, that question belongs to you now. You have heard what the clay remembers. You have followed the legal argument, the reed wall scene, the passenger manifest, the shore of Dilmun. You have heard 3 traditions preserve the same procedural strangeness for over 1,000 years, copy after copy, city after city, until it reached us. Somewhere in Philadelphia, a fragment of baked clay holds the last lines of that record, the seed of mankind, they say, protected at the time of destruction, settled at the place where the sun rises. The rest, as always, is silence. Let it carry you gently into sleep now. The cities are quiet. The plain of Mesopotamia is dark and still. The tablets have said what they had to say. Whatever you carry with you from this, whatever question sits with you now, unresolved and alive, it is yours. The ancient world left it there, in the clay, precisely for this moment to be held and turned over slowly and not quite answered. Rest in that space. The question is not a burden, it is what the flood could not take. If this investigation moves something in you tonight, if the weight of the clay and the shape of the choice settled somewhere in your thinking, we would love to know. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are, what time it is, what it was like to sit with the oldest flood story ever written and hear not just the waters, but the decision behind them. Until next time, wherever you are. The God who kept records Before examining what the flood texts tell us about the choice, it is worth examining from a different angle what they tell us about the chooser. Enki, whose Akkadian name was Ea, whose Sumerian epithet was Denki, Lord of the Earth, and whom Samuel Noah Kramer described in his foundational survey of Sumerian culture as the Lord of Wisdom, who knows the very heart of the gods, is one of the most distinctively drawn figures in the entire Sumerian theological tradition. He is not simply a benevolent deity who happens to like humans. He is, in the Sumerian cosmological framework, the specific god whose domain encompasses precisely the things that civilization requires in order to exist. His temple was the Abzu, the house of the Abzu at Eridu, the oldest city named in both the Sumerian king list and the Eridu Genesis, the city that received kingship first when it descended from heaven. The Abzu was the subterranean ocean of fresh water, the deep reservoir of knowledge and creative potential that Enki was understood to govern. In the Aurak database of ancient Mesopotamian texts maintained by the University of Pennsylvania, the entry for Enki characterizes his temple at Eridu as the center of a domain that included wisdom, craftsmanship, magic, exorcism, music, and the arts of civilization in their totality. The specific Sumerian concept that captures this domain is the me, a word that the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford describes as the divine offices, the sacred functions, the fundamental operational principles of civilization. The me were not metaphors. They were, in the Sumerian theological framework, actual things, portable, transferable, capable of being held by one deity and taken by another. The great mythological text Inanna and Enki, preserved in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period, tells the story of the goddess Inanna travelling to Eridu and obtaining from Enki, while he is intoxicated, the full list of the me, which the text enumerates at considerable length. That list, as preserved in the ECCSL edition, includes kingship, the priestly offices, descent into and ascent from the underworld, truth, the musical instruments, craftsmanship, the scribal arts, the art of smithing, the art of leatherworking, the art of building, the art of weaving, the art of music, the art of wisdom. It includes fire, the flood weapon, sexual intercourse, prostitution, the giving of judgments, the making of decisions. It includes, and this detail matters for our investigation, the preservation of written records, the me of scribal arts, the me of wisdom. These were held before Inanna took them to Uruk in the house of the Abzu at Eridu. They belonged, in the deepest structural sense of Sumerian theology, to Enki. This context reconfigures everything about the reed wall scene. The god who warned Atrahasis was not merely a compassionate exception within the divine council. He was, within the Sumerian theological framework, the specific guardian of the knowledge that a catastrophic flood would destroy. The me were the civilizational functions that Enki held. The craftsmen, the scribes, the practitioners of the arts enumerated in the me list, these were the human embodiments of what Enki governed. When Enki chose to thread one man through the flood, he was not acting outside his domain. He was acting entirely within it. He was preserving what he was the keeper of. The choice, seen from this angle, was not a violation of the divine assembly's decision. It was the exercise of an ancient custodial responsibility that predated the assembly's oath. Enki was the god of the me. The flood threatened the me. The man he chose was the man he had been preparing, through the wisdom tradition of Shuruppak, to carry what the me required of a carrier. This is not a reading that the flood text state explicitly. It is a reading that the theological architecture of the entire Sumerian religious system makes available, and that the text gesture toward repeatedly without ever resolving into a single direct statement, which is of course entirely characteristic of the way Enki communicates in every text in which he appears. The wisdom before the warning. The instructions of Shuruppak are not usually discussed in the context of the flood narrative. They belong to a different literary category, the Sumerian wisdom tradition, the genre of ethical instruction text that scholars like Ben Auster, in his 1974 critical edition published through the Copenhagen Studies in Assyriology series, have analysed as the earliest systematic moral literature in human history. But the connection between the instructions of Shuruppak and the flood story is built into the text itself, and it is not incidental. The oldest surviving copy of the instructions of Shuruppak was excavated at Abu Salabik, a site near ancient Nippur, and dates to approximately 2500 BCs. A second archaic copy from the site of Adab dates to around 2400 BCs. These are among the very oldest literary texts ever recovered, contemporary with the earliest phases of Sumerian written culture, copied and preserved with the same care and attention that would later be applied to the flood narrative itself. The text is presented as advice from a father to his son. The father's name, as given in the opening lines, is Shuruppak, the name of the city itself, personified as a patriarch, and the son to whom this wisdom is addressed is, the text states, Ziusudra. The father of the flood hero is teaching his son how to live before the flood comes. The instructions contain over 200 proverbs and maxims, guidance on how to conduct business, how to treat neighbours, how to approach the gods, how to navigate legal disputes, how to preserve one's reputation across generations. Much of it is practical ethical instruction of the kind that any complex society requires. Do not steal from your neighbour, do not give false testimony, do not neglect the maintenance of your house, honour your mother and father, do not be careless with words said in anger. But embedded within the practical wisdom are passages that resonate differently when read in the context of what Ziusudra is about to face. Lines that counsel the preservation of that which is most essential. Lines that warn against the loss of memory, the failure to transmit, the catastrophe of knowledge that ends with its possessor. Auster's scholarly edition of the instructions, which remains the standard academic reference, characterises the text as representative of what he calls the Sumerian concept of the good life, a life lived in alignment with the divine order, in proper relationship with the community, in attentiveness to the accumulated wisdom of those who came before. A person who lives this way is, in the Sumerian framework, the kind of person the gods can work with. The connection between the instructions of Shuruppak and the flood narrative extends even to the name of the father. In the Sumerian king list, the last antediluvian king is Ubaratutu of Shuruppak. In the Atrahasis tradition, Utnapishtim is identified as the son of Ubaratutu, the same lineage. The flood hero is, in both traditions, the son of the man who held the kingship of the last pre-flood city. He was raised, the instructions suggest, by a tradition of wisdom that the city itself embodied and that his father transmitted to him specifically. He was not chosen from the population at large. He was chosen from the end of a lineage that had been accumulating the kind of wisdom Enki valued for generations. This pattern, the prepared recipient, the inheritor of a cultivated tradition, the student of a teaching that reaches back through the city's deepest roots, changes the nature of the choice in ways that the flood narrative alone does not make visible. Enki did not find a wise man and warn him. The text suggests something closer to the opposite, that the wisdom tradition of Shuruppak had been building toward the production of exactly the kind of person Enki needed, and that when the assembly voted for the flood, Enki already knew who the carrier would be. The reed wall was not a desperate improvisation, it was a communication to a man who had been prepared his entire life to receive it. The tablets that survived the tablets. There is a detail in the Berossus account, the Greek rendering of the Babylonian flood tradition, written by the priest of Bel around 278 BCE and preserved only in quotations by later Byzantine authors, including George Syncellus, that the Cuneiform tradition approaches but never quite states as directly. The god Kronos, coming in for the Babylonian Marduk ear in the Greek rendering, commands Xisuthros, the Greek form of Ziusudra, to do something before he builds the boat and before he loads his family. He commands him to bury all the written records. The Livius.org translation of the Berossus passage, drawn from George Syncellus's chronological excerpts, renders it this way. He then ordered him to bury together all the tablets, the first, the middle and the last, and hide them in Sippar, the city of the sun. The instruction is specific. Not some tablets. Not important tablets. All of them, the first, the middle and the last, a phrase that in the context of a library or archive would mean the complete holdings, the entire range of written knowledge from the earliest records to the most recent. Everything. Buried in Sippar, the antediluvian city of the sun god, before the boat was launched. And after the flood, the survivors are told by a divine voice to go to Sippar and dig up what was buried there and to turn it over to mankind. The reconstruction of Babylonia, as Berossus presents it, begins not with the planting of crops or the building of houses, but with the recovery of written records. The civilization is rebuilt from its archive. This detail does not appear in the cuneiform flood texts in this explicit form. The Sumerian and Akkadian traditions mention the cargo of the ark, the craftsman, the seed of all living things. They do not describe a separate act of archival burial in a city that the flood hero then departs. The Berossus account may be preserving a tradition that was lost from the cuneiform versions as they were edited across centuries, or it may be a later elaboration built from the scribal culture's own values, the belief that written knowledge was so precious that it required its own survival. Strategy, independent of the man on the boat. Either way, the idea it encodes is consistent with everything the cuneiform tradition implies. The civilization that came after the flood was understood in the Babylonian tradition that Berossus was recording as a civilization that rebuilt itself from buried knowledge. The first act of post-flood governance was recovery, not of territory, not of political authority, but of written records, and the act was commanded specifically by the same god who commanded the boat. The tablets buried in Sippar and the craftsman loaded onto the ark are two versions of the same strategy, the distribution of civilizational knowledge across multiple survival mechanisms, so that if one failed, another might carry what was needed through the catastrophe. This is not how a myth of divine destruction typically works. In myths of destruction, the flood erases. In myths of salvation, a worthy individual is preserved. What the Mesopotamian tradition records, when read in its full context, cuneiform sources and Greek transmission together, is something more systematic. A preservation architecture, a plan for what knowledge needed to survive, where it needed to be placed, and how it would re-enter the world after the waters receded. The man on the boat, the tablets in the ground, the craftsman below decks, the seed of all living things in the hold. And somewhere in Dilmun, at the place where the sun rises, the man who coordinated all of it, placed now beyond the world he seeded, in the only location where the flood could not reach him, and from which he would never return, the silence after the waters. What the flood left behind, according to the Sumerian king list, was not chaos, it was not emptiness. What the flood left behind was the condition for a different kind of beginning. The king list records that after the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to the city of Kish, far to the north of the antediluvian cities in the middle Euphrates Valley. The first king of this new dynasty was Jushur, who reigned for 1,200 years. Already the reign lengths have fallen by an order of magnitude from the tens of thousands of years that characterized the pre-flood kings. By the third and fourth rulers of Kish, the numbers have fallen further still. The world that emerges from the flood is measurably different from the world that preceded it, different in its scale of time, different in its relationship between human lifespan and political authority, different in the texture of what the king list records. It is, in the language of the Atrahasis epic, the world that Enki and Enlil negotiated into existence after their post-flood confrontation. Enlil accepted what had survived. Enki accepted that the noise problem would be managed differently going forward through the mechanisms of population control that the text records Enki himself proposing, the social structures that would limit human reproduction and lifespan to something closer to the scale the gods could tolerate. The world after the flood was in this reading not a restoration of what existed before, it was a redesign. The antediluvian civilization, vast, long-lived, noisy, productive of the kind of rigmu that could keep a god awake for 10,000 years, was not brought back. What was brought back was the essential minimum, the seed of mankind, the me of civilization, the technical knowledge held in the minds of craftsmen, and the written records buried in sip. From these, something different grew. The cities that appear in the historical record after the flood, Kish, then Uruk under the legendary Gilgamesh, then Ur, then Lagash, then the great flowering of Sumerian literary culture in the Year 3 period, are not copies of the antediluvian world. They are a new structure, built on the foundation that was carried through the catastrophe, operating within the constraints that the post-flood divine negotiation established. The civilization that produced CBSN 673, the tablet that records all of this, was itself the product of what was carried on the ark. The scribes who pressed the story into clay were the distant inheritors of the craftsmen who had been loaded aboard by specific instruction. The wisdom tradition they were preserving, the flood narrative, the king list, the instructions of Shuruppak, the hymns to Dilmun, was the tradition that had been seeded in the silence after the waters. There is a reflexive quality to this that the ancient scribes almost certainly recognized. They were copying a story about the preservation of knowledge, using the knowledge that had been preserved to ensure that preservation continued. The act of copying the flood tablets was itself an enactment of what the flood tablets described, and they did it for over 1,000 years. What Enki knew that the others did not. Across the three major flood traditions, one structural pattern holds without variation. Enlil proposes the destruction, the assembly agrees, and Enki finds a way to preserve what the decision would have eliminated. This pattern is so consistent, repeated not just in the flood narrative, but in the earlier episodes of the Atrahasis epic, where Enki intervenes against Enlil's plague and Enlil's famine, that it functions as a theological constant within the Sumerian religious framework. Enlil destroys, Enki preserves. But the reason for this consistency is worth examining beyond the simple characterization of one god as harsh and another as compassionate. The texts offer a more specific account. In the post-flood scene of the Gilgamesh tradition, K3375, when Enlil demands to know how a man survived, Ninurta answers, "Who else but Ea could do such a thing? It is Ea who knows all of our plans." The phrase "who knows all of our plans" is not simply a rebuke, it is a description of an attribute. Enki, knows all the plans of the gods, because his domain, the Abzu, is the source of the wisdom that undergirds all divine decision-making. He is not simply wiser than Enlil in the way that one person might be wiser than another. He occupies a different structural position in the cosmic order, one that gives him access to the implications of decisions that other gods cannot foresee. What Enki knew, what the tradition consistently characterizes as the specific knowledge that differentiates him from the other members of the assembly, was the long-term consequence of total destruction. He knew what losing the me would mean. He knew what a world without craftsmen, without scribes, without the accumulated technical knowledge of a civilization looked like. He had, in a sense that the Sumerian framework makes literal, already been through this calculation, because the me were the things that made civilization possible, and he was their keeper. The Atrahasis epic's post-flood argument between Enki and Enlil is at its core an argument about consequences. Enlil saw the immediate problem, the noise, the overpopulation, the exhaustion of divine patience, and proposed a proportionate response within the framework of power available to him. Enki saw the same problem and the same response, and also saw what came after. the silence of a world without the humans who had built it, the hunger of gods without the farmers who fed them, the emptiness of cities whose temples no longer received offerings. Enki's objection to the flood was not sentimental, it was structural. The flood eliminated the problem by eliminating the structure that produced the problem, and since the gods depended on that structure as much as the humans who maintained it, the elimination was catastrophic for both. The preservation of one man was Enki's minimal intervention, the smallest modification to the outcome of the assembly's decision that would prevent the permanent loss of what the decision would otherwise have destroyed. Not the reversal of the flood, not the defiance of the assembly, simply the careful, legally defensible threading of a single thread of continuity through the catastrophe, so that what was on the other side could be rewoven. This is the choice behind the one man saved from the flood. Not love, exactly, though the tradition does not exclude love, not disobedience, though the other gods experience it as disobedience. It is, in the fullest reading the texts make available, the act of a god who understood that civilizations are not rebuilt from survivors alone, but from the knowledge that survivors carry, and who made certain that the right knowledge, in the right person, reached the other side intact. What 3,000 years of copying knew? The final question this investigation raises is not about the flood. It is about the scribes. Consider what it means that the Atrahasis epic, composed in its surviving form around 1700 BC during the reign of Ammi-Saduqa, was still being copied in Nineveh in the 7th century BC 1,000 years later. Consider that the Eridugenesis, pressed on to CBS 1673 in the 17th century BC, was recognised in 1912 by a 20th century scholar as the oldest version of the flood story ever recovered. Consider that Berossus, writing in 278 BC, over 1,000 years after the Nineveh copies and almost 2,000 years after the old Babylonian originals, was still drawing on traditions that preserved the core structure, the divine decision, the one man warned, the buried tablets, the reconstruction from recovered knowledge. The flood narrative was not simply a popular story. Popular stories in the ancient world were abbreviated, simplified, made memorable through reduction. The flood narrative moved in the opposite direction across time. It grew more detailed, more technically specific, more legally precise as it was copied and expanded. The Gilgamesh compiler added engineering specifications. The old Babylonian schools preserved the legal theology of the divine oath. Berossus added the archival instruction. Each generation of scribes who worked with this material added what their specific competence allowed them to see. The engineering scribes added the cubits and the bitumen. The legal scribes preserved the mamatu and the reed wall loophole. The archival scribes, those who spent their working lives maintaining the tablet houses of the great Mesopotamian cities, recognized in the tradition the thing that mattered most to them, that what had been saved was saved in writing, in tablets, in the clay that their own hands pressed every day. This is not an accident of transmission. The scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia understood its own work as continuous with what the flood tradition described. The physical act of copying a tablet was, within their theological framework, an act of preservation, a small repetition of the archival work that had kept civilization alive across the catastrophe. They were doing what Sesothros's companions had done at Sippar, digging up what was buried and turning it over to mankind. The tablet in Philadelphia is part of this chain. CBS 10673, pressed into clay in the 17th century BC by a scribe whose name we do not know, in the city of Nippur, where Enlil's temple stood at the centre of the Sumerian religious world, this small object is itself an act of transmission. It is a link in the chain that connects the pre-flood world to the world we inhabit, carrying a story about carrying a story. The scribes who copied it were not naive recipients of tradition. The Aduba schools of Nippur, documented in administrative tablets and literary texts from the old Babylonian period, were rigorous institutions that taught not just the mechanics of Cuneiform, but the content of the tradition. the flood narrative, the king list, the instructions of Shuruppak, the hymns and laments and legal texts that constituted Sumerian civilizational memory. Students copied these texts not as passive exercises, but as acts of intellectual apprenticeship, learning what was worth knowing by practicing the transmission of what was known. The flood narrative was worth knowing. Generation after generation decided this. City after city, dynasty after dynasty, through the Akkadian period and the Year 3 period and the Old Babylonian and the Kassite and the Neo-Assyrian and finally the late Babylonian tradition that Berossus was recording in Greek, for a world that had shifted its language but not its memory. The story of one man, one choice, and what was carried across the waters was judged repeatedly and consistently to be among the things that needed to survive. The question the clay leaves open. There is a reason the flood narrative has no ending that satisfies the question it raises. Utnapishtim, at the end of his account in Gilgamesh Tablet C, does not explain why he was chosen. He tells Gilgamesh what happened: the assembly, the oath, the dream, the boat, the flood, the landing, the confrontation with Enlil, the elevation to immortality at the mouth of the rivers. He tells it with the precision of a man who has told it many times to the few who have made it this far across the waters of death to sit before him. And when Gilgamesh, having heard everything, asks what he came to ask, "How can I find what you found? How can I not die?" Utnapishtim's answer is silence, followed by a challenge: "Can you stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights?" Gilgamesh cannot. He falls asleep immediately after Utnapishtim stops speaking. The structural message is clear. The circumstances that produce the flood hero's survival, the specific convergence of divine politics, divine friendship, a divine loophole, and a human prepared to hear through walls, cannot be reproduced. They were assembled, the text suggests, with extraordinary care by a God who understood what was at stake. They were not a template. They were a singular event, recorded in clay precisely because singular events, once past, exist only in memory, and memory, as every scribe in every Aduba knew, requires a carrier. What CBS 1673 carries, in its fragmentary 13 centimetres, is not just the story. It carries the question the story refuses to close. Why him? What made him the seed of mankind? What did Enki see in the man sleeping by the reed wall that convinced him, despite the oath, despite the assembly, despite the legal and political risk, that this specific thread of continuity was worth the careful construction of a divine loophole? The tablets give us the shape of the answer without filling it in completely. He was extra wise. He was the son of a city that taught its sons well. He was in relationship with the right God. He was sleeping in the right place when the right night came. He was prepared to hear what was communicated through walls rather than doors, to receive what was oblique and act on it as if it had been direct. He was, in the language available to the tradition, the kind of person that knowledge chooses. Not the most powerful, not the most celebrated, not the king who sat in the highest seat of the last pre-flood city, the man who heard the wall. And that hearing, that specific, cultivated, lifelong attentiveness to what was being said by the world around him, was what Enki knew no flood could manufacture. It could only be preserved. So it was.